Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Tuesday, February 28th, 2023. What we talk about when we talk about podcasts. Every podcaster thinks they know what their audience likes, but this week, I'm going to share some strategies to actually get that audience talking and directly telling you what they like. But first, this week on the Sounds Profitable Deep Dive, Bryan Barletta is joined by SoundStack co-founder Rocky Thomas to discuss SoundStack's independent, tech-agnostic audio ad exchange. Tune in to hear how they pursue giving every audio publisher, big and small, equal access to the tech and partners of their choice. And that's on this week's Sounds Profitable Deep Dive. So this past weekend, I hopped a prop plane to Canada, where I attended and spoke at PodCamp Toronto, one of my favorite cities in the world. When I talk to indie podcasters at events like this one, my topic is often a variant on the same theme. How do we master our craft? How do we get better as podcasters and create work that is recommendable beyond our immediate social circle? I'll boil it down to this. There are two levers that podcasters can pull to produce their best work. You can master your knowledge of the process of podcasting, and you can master your knowledge of the audience. Now, we spend a lot of time on the former. You could just look at the schedule of any podcasting event to make that math crystal clear. But as an industry, we spend very little time on the latter. In fact, the biggest lie I think we tell ourselves as podcasters is this: I know my audience. Well, let me assure you, unless your audience consists solely of friends and family, and, well, we've all been there, you don't know your audience. You don't know your audience as well as you could. Now, I could spend 5 minutes with you quizzing you about the habits and beliefs and values of your audience and how they talk about your show, and I bet I could stump you with basics every single time. In fact, I could stump myself about this very podcast the exact same way. We're all fighting a great battle here. Now, I've spent the last 25 years studying the care and feeding of an audience, and I'll be the first to admit that I don't always understand what works and what doesn't. It's a practice. It's a discipline to incorporate the voice of the listener into every single thing we do. For my larger network clients, this often takes the form of listener surveys and other formal research projects. But I have to be honest here, even at the highest levels of podcasting, not enough of this kind of work is being done to truly understand the most important thing you can know about your audience: why they chose your show. And more importantly, why and how would they recommend it to a friend? Instead, most of the work being done in podcasting is about understanding the listener as product, the thing that we bundle up and sell to advertisers so we can put food on our families, as W once said. Now, if that sounds cynical, I don't mean it to sound cynical. Advertiser-focused research is what's paying the bills for all of us in the ad-supported world. And those bills need to be paid before we can invest in content research and any of the other flights of fancy I talk about here. Advertisers want to know the age and gender and income of your audience. They want to know if you have kids or a 401k or an aging car or an expiring phone contract. But none of those things will help your show get better. So what will? And more importantly, how can podcasters with limited resources learn more about their audience and what makes them tick? Now, here's a crazy thought. You talk to them. Now, I'm not talking about an audience survey or conducting focus groups or anything like that. Just talk to them. Let them know in your show itself that you'd love to open a dialogue with them, a phone call, a Zoom, an email, and learn more about why they listen, what keeps them coming back, and what you could do to improve. You could do this in like I said, an email or a conversation, a Slack channel, a Google form, and yeah, even a survey. As long as you open a dialogue, you're doing the work. But here's the issue. We don't always know the right questions to ask. Now, after hundreds of focus groups with literally tens of thousands of humans all over the world, I can assure you that if you ask a listener what they think of your podcast, the answer is going to be this: I don't know. I like it. It's pretty good. It's funny. It's interesting. That's super helpful. Now, the reality is that humans, especially American humans, have access to a much greater vocabulary for what they don't like than what they do. With a generic question like, what do you think of my podcast? You're likely to get a very generic positive answer. It's when we don't like something that we gain access to a more specific lexicon. Read reviews on Yelp or Amazon and see if I'm not right about this. People who love a particular restaurant will note that the food is good and the service is fast and friendly. But you overcook someone's steak, and you'll get more words for that than the Inuit have for snow. So what do we talk about when we talk about our podcasts? Now, the key to generating insight is to avoid questions that are hypothetical, abstract, or general. That's HAG, if you're playing along, in favor of those that are specific, actual, and personal, or SAP. These are really awful acronyms. My apologies. And that's Rama. So here are 5 plus great questions that you can ask your listeners that will genuinely help you understand them better and thus serve them better. I shared these with the attendees at PodCamp Toronto, and now I'm going to share them with you. Number 1, how did you discover my show? Now, often when we ask this in listener surveys, it's asked for marketing purposes. What channels are more effective in terms of promoting the show, and which ones should I spend less time on? Now, that's all true, but I prefer to ask this question to understand the exact transaction or negotiation that occurred at the moment of discovery, and not to learn which channel to invest more heavily in. After all, the top means of discovery in podcasting continues to be recommendations from friends and family, and really there's no way we can increase our friends and family promotional budgets. Instead, I like to get down to the actual moment, if the listener remembers. Was it a recommendation? What was the context for that? What information did you give the recommender? And then how did they sell the show to you? If you were searching for a show, what exactly were you searching for? Did you get it? Did you get something different? Again, specific, actual, and personal. Now, these kinds of questions probably work best in an actual conversation or a video call, but I bet you have listeners that would be thrilled to do that with you. Number 2, what other podcasts do you listen to? Now, this is another question often used for marketing purposes. Where can I run promos? And that's actually not the most important use of this question. I submit it's actually more important for insight. Now, when I ask this question, I'm trying to get to the heart of the consideration set of the listener and where my show slots into that. Is my sportscast the only sportscast that they listen to? Why is that? Or is it one of 5? Why do they bother? And what does my show give them that the rest don't? What I'm trying to discover here, as James Joyce asks in Ulysses, who's he when he's at home? And of course, who's she and who are they? Now, understanding the full media diet of your listener and where exactly your show slots into that, that's the key to leaving deeper footprints with an audience. Sometimes it's in the vocabulary of other things that they listen to that a listener gains the language to describe what your show is or is not. Number 3, would you make the show shorter or longer? Now, this is an excellent way to turn a lousy question, how long should my podcast be, into an insight-generating question. A listener cannot tell you how long your podcast should be. That isn't their job. They might give you an answer to that question as a kind of Stockholm Syndrome relief, but it won't be particularly valuable. But asking about making the show shorter or longer is an entree to a better question. What would you cut or do less of if the answer is make it shorter? Or what would you like to enjoy more of if the answer is make it longer? These are things the listener can talk about intelligently and in a way that's actionable for you. And anyway, the answer to how long should my podcast be, which is one of the crappiest questions of all time, is, of course, shorter than your last one. Number 4, and this is really the question plus here, it's a bit of a two-parter, but if you only have time to talk to someone about one thing, I'd recommend a variation of this line of questioning. First, think about a friend or a family member who would like this show, an actual human, and tell me about them. This is a question for you to ask a listener. Think about a friend or family member who would like this show and tell me about them. Who are they? What do they look like? What do they do for a living? why would you make this recommendation to them? Tell me as much as you can about that person as you can possibly cough up, right? That's all part one. And then part two of this is the logical conclusion. Describe the show for that person. Sell the show for that individual specific human being. What would you highlight? Why? Now, the key here, again, is to push beyond the abstract and the aggregate and learn as much as you possibly can about this specific real human that they're thinking about and the specific way that your listener would talk about your show to them, right down to inside jokes and other shared experiences that maybe only those two would have. The more detail that you can elicit here, the more insight you'll have into how people really think about what it is you are doing. They may highlight a strength of yours that you weren't even considering. They might also apologize to their friend for something that they don't really care for about the show, but it's overshadowed by something else positive that they do recommend. Getting people to imagine a specific actual human who would like the show and how they would pitch the show to that human is the key to getting the vocabulary that you might use to pitch the show to larger audiences yourself. Some of the most powerful brands in media have made these kinds of insights key to their DNA. The example I like to give here is Taco Bell, which actually launched in this country on a message of fresh. There were lots of TV commercials of knives cutting through glistening heads of lettuce, that kind of thing. But why do we eat at Taco Bell today? Because it's late and we're drunk. Look at their marketing today. The glistening heads of lettuce are gone, and they've been replaced by Dorito-encrusted Mountain Dew chalupas that you can get at 2 a.m. because they realized the thing that we already knew. It's late and we're drunk. Now, finally, here's a question that I like to end any focus group with. I call it the eulogy question. If this show were to die tomorrow, never be produced again, buried in the ground, what one thing, if any, would you miss? Now, I want to warn you here that the answer might well be nothing. That's a problem, and you need to know it. But people are more articulate in describing loss than gain. They might tell you that your show is good or it's funny, but you take that same show away, and you're likely to get a very specific thing, and maybe one that you hadn't even considered as core to your show. I'll give you an example from my own podcast listening. I listen to multiple episodes of the Ryan Russillo podcast every week, every one that he puts out 2 or 3 a week. It's a sports podcast. And if you were to ask me what I like about it, I could certainly talk about his reasoned and enlightened takes on sports, his different perspective on the business of sports, and the guests that he have. But if that show were taken away from me, my eulogy would talk about one thing and one thing only, and that's a segment called Life Advice. At the end of every show, Ryan takes listener emails from largely Gen Z and millennial males who are looking for advice on their real-life problems and either need a dad or a big brother or sometimes just a referee to help them adjudicate real-life disputes with their friends. Now, Ryan here serves as the dad or big brother who's been through it, while producer Kyle sits in as the younger voice of the audience. And it's deftly done, it's wildly entertaining, and it works on multiple levels. If you take that away, I'd still listen. The show would be good, but I would mourn the loss of life advice more than any sports content on the show. And finally, make it all worthwhile. That's 5+ really good questions to talk to people when you're talking about your show. Now, that's not quantitative research, although you could certainly test the things that you learn in these conversations with a survey down the road. The things you're looking for here, they don't need to be verified by hundreds of listeners. If you're getting the exact same language about something from multiple people, then the universe is telling you something about your show, and you should at least consider it. The last thing I'll say about these questions is that you should make answering them a value proposition for your listeners. Make it worthwhile. If you're asking them to give you details about any or all of these things, make it worth their while with swag or stickers or exclusive content or access to something special. They are, after all, self-selecting as having a deeper relationship with your show simply by choosing to respond. And when you've had those conversations and perhaps even made some changes in your show, close the loop by acknowledging that the show continues to improve thanks to the time that the audience has gifted you by sharing their thoughts with you. If you're highlighting something new or the removal of something old, make a point of thanking the listeners for helping you make those decisions. Now, in a future podcast, I'll expand on what you can do with some of this information, but start collecting it now. Start having conversations. Ultimately, there's nothing more important for you to know than why people listen to or stop listening to your show. The key to learning those answers is to ground your questions in real life with real people in real situations. And of course, to turn off your mic and listen. Thanks again for listening to this podcast, What We Talk About When We Talk About Podcasts. This episode was built using Spooler and hosted on ART19. I'm Tom Webster for Sounds Profitable, and we'll see you next time.